hall was vast, lined with banners carrying the insignias of nations, their flags glimmering under the chandelier lights. Cameras swept across the room like silent predators, catching every movement, every glance, every breath of the leaders who had gathered. This was no ordinary summit. It was a meeting where continents sought to redraw the lines of power, where alliances were not only discussed but performed, where words would travel farther than armies. From the Gulf, the Saudi delegation entered with calculated precision. Men in white robes and polished black cloaks moved in formation, surrounding their leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known to the world as MBS. He walked with the kind of confidence that wealth and influence breed, his gaze steady, his chin raised just enough to remind others of his stature. To many in the room, he represented opportunity, endless money for infrastructure, energy, and technology. To others, he represented something more dangerous, a reminder that Africa's independence was still shadowed by outside interests. On the opposite side sat a younger man. Ibrahim Traoré, the soldier-turned-leader of Burkina Faso, leaned forward in his chair, silent, watchful. At only his early 30s, he carried himself with the fire of a revolutionary, but the patience of a strategist. His uniform, plain compared to the ceremonial suits around him, seemed almost out of place in the ornate hall. Yet the eyes of journalists kept returning to him. He had already become a symbol, a leader who spoke of Africa's sovereignty with a sharpness that unsettled the old order. The atmosphere thickened as the summit began. Speeches rolled on, filled with promises of cooperation, investment, and shared futures. Each leader offered words that sounded smooth but predictable. Behind the applause, deals were being imagined. Pipelines, railways, digital corridors, new trade routes. And then, as the cameras zoomed in, MBS took the stage. The hall stilled. He adjusted his robe, paused, and allowed the silence to collect around him like armor. His voice, deep and measured, echoed through the chamber. "We'll lead Africa." The words fell heavy, simple yet loaded. They carried the weight of centuries of kings, sultans, colonizers, and investors who had made similar promises. For some, it was inspiring, Saudi Arabia extending its hand as a guide. For others, it was dangerous, another declaration that Africa was incapable of steering itself. The room reacted in layers. Some delegates nodded, accustomed to hearing such language from global powers. Others shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the African bloc of leaders to gauge their reaction. The cameras panned quickly, searching for expressions that could become tomorrow's headlines. And there sat Traoré, still, silent, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on MBS. The young captain's face revealed nothing, but inside the room, everyone could feel it, the expectation, the anticipation, the sense that he would not let such words pass unchallenged. The narrator's voice, if this were a film, would say, "In that silence, history held its breath." Journalists scribbled. Cameras lingered on the tension. The stage had been set, but the duel of words had not yet begun. Traoré's silence was its own form of defiance, louder than applause, sharper than protest. And for a moment, even MBS seemed aware that his statement had landed on contested ground. The scene was no longer just about trade or cooperation or diplomacy. It had become a theater of power. The heir of a kingdom, vast in oil and influence, had spoken as if Africa were a prize to be guided. Across from him sat a man who had risen not by inheritance or wealth, but by the rallying cry of his people. A soldier who had tasted rebellion and carved his legitimacy from struggle. And so the cameras lingered, the murmurs grew, and the world, watching through broadcasts, leaned closer. Everyone knew something was about to happen. A storm was gathering, not of weapons but of words. But Traoré did not rush. He let the silence work. He let the statement echo, hang, and unravel itself. Only then, slowly, did he shift in his seat, lean forward, and prepare to speak. The hall, once restless, was now utterly still. The applause that followed MBS's statement was polite but uneven. Some clapped out of habit, others out of strategy, and a few simply touched their hands together without conviction, careful not to be caught on camera betraying their real thoughts. The words had landed in the room like a challenge, and everyone knew it. MBS did not pause for long. He stepped forward, his robe sweeping the stage with the grace of someone accustomed to being at the center. His voice deepened, amplified by the hall's perfect acoustics. "Africa's future is bright," he declared, his eyes scanning the audience. But to realize its true potential, it needs leadership, direction, and vision. The kingdom is ready to provide that. We bring resources, we bring investment, we bring stability. Together we can build a new era. The words carried weight, not only because of who said them, but because of what they implied. Leadership in his framing was not African. It was external. It was imported. Africa, in this narrative, was a field waiting for cultivation, not a voice directing its own destiny. The audience shifted again. Some delegates whispered to each other, sensing the tension thickening. Others scribbled notes, already predicting the fiery responses that would ripple through African capitals once these words were replayed on television. But MBS was not finished. He leaned closer to the microphone, his tone hardening into certainty. We have already proven our ability to lead beyond our borders. Our projects in energy, infrastructure, and security have transformed regions. Africa deserves the same opportunities, and we, Saudi Arabia, will be the ones to make it happen. He paused deliberately, allowing the echo of his words to fill the hall. The Crown Prince's confidence was unshaken. He was a man used to commanding rooms, to speaking and watching others bend toward his orbit. His delegation behind him nodded in rhythm, echoing his authority. The cameras darted, catching the faces of African leaders. Some remained neutral, practiced in the art of diplomacy, but others betrayed flickers of discomfort. Because the statement, "We'll lead Africa," was not just rhetoric. It was a claim, a declaration that Africa was still in need of guardianship, still unfinished, still unable to chart its own course without a guiding hand. And then the cameras cut to Ibrahim Traoré. He had not moved much since the statement. His posture remained calm, his face unreadable, but his eyes, those gave everything away. They burned not with outrage, but with calculation, like the slow ignition of a fuse. The narration might have said, where others heard opportunity, he heard an old story retold in new words. Traoré's advisors leaned in, whispering softly, their voices lost in the buzz of the hall. But the young leader did not answer them. He kept his eyes fixed on MBS, watching as the Saudi leader concluded his remarks with promises of prosperity and stability, ending on a note of triumph. The applause this time was stronger, louder, yet not unanimous. There was energy in the room, but it was not unified. Some clapped because they believed in the promise. Others clapped because they feared the cost of not being aligned. And some clapped simply to fill the silence, desperate to conceal the growing divide. As MBS stepped down from the podium, his presence lingered. He returned to his seat with the ease of someone who believed he had secured the stage. His smirk, brief but visible, betrayed his confidence. He believed the narrative was his. But across the aisle, Traoré shifted slightly, finally breaking the stillness that had held him since the opening remarks. He did not rise immediately. Instead, he rested his hand on the table before him, drumming his fingers once, twice, as if testing the rhythm of the moment. The cameras caught it. Journalists noticed. The anticipation sharpened. One journalist whispered into her recorder, "He's going to respond, watch, he's waiting for the perfect silence." And she was right, because in diplomacy, timing is power. The moderator of the summit, sensing the tension, invited the next speaker. But the room seemed unwilling to move forward. All eyes were drawn to Traoré, as though the very air demanded his reply. He rose slowly, not with the sweeping gesture of a showman, but with the steady composure of a soldier who knows the battlefield is already his. The room hushed. Even the clicking of cameras seemed to soften, as if the machines themselves recognized the gravity of the moment. Traoré stepped toward the microphone, his boots echoing faintly against the polished floor. He did not look at the audience first. He looked directly at MBS, a direct line of sight. A challenge not shouted but made clear. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady. Unlike MBS's grand declarations, Traoré's words carried the weight of defiance through their simplicity. Africa leads itself. The sentence cut through the hall like a blade through cloth, short, sharp, unmistakable. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. For a heartbeat, the entire room froze. Delegates stared, some with wide eyes, some with restrained smirks, others with carefully hidden approval. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the collision of two worlds. One leader, rich with oil and wealth, claiming Africa's destiny as his to guide. Another, young and unyielding, declaring Africa's sovereignty with 6 words that shattered the illusion of dependency. Reporters rushed to capture the phrase. their pens racing as though it would slip away if not written fast enough. Africa leads itself. It was not just a reply. It was a rejection, a declaration, and a rallying cry condensed into a single line. And though Traoré did not raise his voice, though he did not add more, the weight of those words filled the hall as if he had shouted them from a mountaintop. MBS shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. The cameras caught it. The world would see it. A moment of power, briefly unsettled. Traoré stepped back, his expression calm as though he had said nothing extraordinary. But everyone in the room knew something had shifted. The clash had begun. The hall trembled not with sound but with silence. After Traoré's words, 6 words, no more, the air felt denser, heavier, as if the chandeliers above had lowered themselves to listen more closely. Africa leads itself. No elaboration, no speech, no explanation. Just that single sharpened sentence. For a long moment, Traoré remained at the podium, his hands resting lightly on the edges as though anchoring himself against the weight of history. His gaze did not waver. He did not look to the cameras nor to the restless crowd. His eyes stayed locked on MBS as if the two men were standing alone in the room, stripped of advisors, flags, and ceremony. The audience responded in waves. Some tried to clap, hesitant and scattered. Others sat frozen, unsure whether applause would signal endorsement or rebellion. Delegates shifted uncomfortably, whispering translations of the line into earpieces, watching reactions ripple like shockwaves. Narration might have said, "In every era there comes a moment when a single sentence holds more power than 1,000 speeches." This was one of them. MBS leaned back in his chair, the faintest tightening in his jaw betraying irritation. For a man accustomed to controlling the room with declarations, being answered with such unflinching brevity was disarming, yet his face quickly reset, a polished mask of composure. His advisors, however, whispered frantically, scribbling notes, recalculating strategy. Across the hall, African leaders exchanged glances. Some nodded almost imperceptibly, their approval hidden but unmistakable. Others looked cautious. Supporting Traoré's words might ignite tensions they weren't prepared to handle. But whether they agreed or feared, none could deny the resonance of the phrase. The press gallery had erupted into silent frenzy. Pens scratched, keys clacked, cameras zoomed in to capture every flicker of expression. One journalist mouthed the words to herself as if testing their rhythm. Africa leads itself. She knew already it would headline tomorrow's front pages. Traoré, however, did not press further. He did not seize the microphone for a long speech or drown the hall in rhetoric. Instead, he let the silence expand, let the weight of his words do the work. In politics, silence can be louder than thunder, and Traoré wielded it like a weapon. At last, he stepped back from the podium. His boot struck the polished floor with steady rhythm, measured, deliberate, unhurried. Each step seemed to echo the words he had spoken, as if the hall itself repeated them. He returned to his seat, folded his hands on the table, and leaned back with calm assurance. The cameras caught his expression, composed, steady, almost serene. It was the face of a man who had not merely spoken but declared. The moderator cleared his throat, fumbling to regain control. He announced the next speaker, though his voice cracked slightly. It was difficult to follow a moment that had already rewritten the summit's narrative. Delegates tried to shift their attention, but they couldn't. Even as the next official began a carefully rehearsed address about trade and cooperation, eyes kept drifting toward Traoré and MBS, the two poles of tension around which the entire hall now orbited. MBS whispered briefly with an advisor, nodding with faint annoyance. His fingers tapped lightly on the table, an uncharacteristic tell. Though outwardly calm, inwardly he was calculating, reassessing. He had made a claim of leadership, and Traoré had cut it down with one sentence. The duel was far from over. Outside the summit walls, the world was already reacting. Social media exploded as live translations hit the airwaves. Clips of the moment spread in seconds, the phrase already becoming a slogan. Africa leads itself began trending across platforms, picked up by activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike. Memes, posters, and banners flooded timelines, turning Traoré's 6 words into a digital rallying cry. In Ouagadougou, Dakar, Lagos, and Johannesburg, people watching on screens in cafes and homes sat up straighter. Many had heard promises before, from colonizers, from corporations, from politicians. But this was different. This was defiance distilled into language. Narration would say, Sometimes a revolution does not begin with a march but with a sentence. And in those 6 words, Africa heard itself. Back inside the hall, the atmosphere remained charged. The current speaker's voice droned on, but it felt like background noise. Delegates' eyes darted, measuring, weighing what had just occurred. Some scribbled notes to their teams, prepare statements, prepare responses. Traoré sat quietly, his silence more commanding than any speech. He seemed almost detached, as though he had not just delivered the line that cracked the summit wide open. But those who studied him closely knew better. This was strategy. The soldier understood the battlefield. And on this stage, silence was his artillery. MBS, meanwhile, prepared his counter. He adjusted his robe, straightened his shoulders, and rehearsed lines in his mind. He would respond. He would reclaim the narrative. He was not a man accustomed to conceding ground. The cameras knew it. They lingered on him, waiting for the moment he would strike back. But that moment had not yet come. For now, all that remained was the echo of Traoré's words, resonating through the chamber, bouncing off the marble walls, imprinting themselves into history. Africa leads itself. And as the summit moved on, the audience knew the true debate had only just begun. The moderator shuffled his notes nervously, trying to hold the summit together, but the center of gravity had already shifted. Every word spoken by the next speakers faded against the memory of what had just occurred. Delegates nodded politely. Cameras still rolled, but minds were elsewhere. The duel between MBS and Traoré had hijacked the entire stage. And then, as if answering the invisible pull of history, Traoré leaned forward. His chair creaked faintly, and that single sound seemed louder than the ongoing speech. He pressed a button on the microphone before him, signaling he wished to respond. The moderator's relief was visible. At least now the tension could be directed instead of left hanging. The hall hushed once more. Traoré stood, the weight of expectation pressing down on his shoulders, but his movements betrayed no hesitation. He walked to the podium with the same steady rhythm as before, the boots of a soldier rather than the polished shoes of a diplomat. When he arrived, he did not begin immediately. He let his silence stretch, scanning the faces before him, leaders, ministers, journalists, all waiting. When he finally spoke, his voice carried not with the booming cadence of a practiced orator, but with the plain conviction of a man stating a truth. Africa leads itself. He repeated the line not as defense but as foundation. Then he expanded. We have heard promises before. Promises from kings, from presidents, from colonizers, from investors. They arrive dressed as opportunity, but they leave behind dependency. They arrive with gifts, but they depart with ownership. Africa has walked that road too many times. And today we say clearly, no more. The hall stirred. The words were calm, measured, but they struck with precision. Delegates leaned forward, caught between fascination and unease. Our people, Traoré continued, do not ask for new masters. They ask for dignity. They do not ask for leaders from abroad. They ask for leaders who rise from their own soil, who carry their pain, their hope, their history. Africa does not need to be led. Africa needs only to be respected. His tone did not rise, yet every syllable landed like a hammer. Some in the audience began nodding, no longer able to conceal agreement. Others shifted in discomfort, knowing these words would ripple far beyond the walls of this hall. Cameras zoomed in on MBS. His expression was composed, but his stillness revealed the tension beneath. His fingers tightened slightly on the arm of his chair. He had not expected to be challenged so directly, so openly. Traoré pressed on. We welcome partnership. We welcome cooperation. But partnership is not ownership. Cooperation is not command. If you come to Africa, you must walk beside us, not ahead of us, not above us, equal or not at all. The hall erupted, not in applause but in murmurs, the kind that ripple through a crowd when truth collides with expectation. Translators scrambled in their booths, their voices struggling to keep pace with the force of the message. Journalists' pens raced. Narration would have said, what began as a reply had become a manifesto. Traoré paused, allowing the words to settle like dust after an explosion. He glanced around the hall, his gaze meeting faces one by one. Then, for the first time, he looked directly into the cameras. His eyes, sharp and unflinching, seemed to pierce through the lens, reaching audiences far beyond the room. To the world watching, hear this clearly. Africa does not stand in line, waiting to be led. Africa stands upright, walking forward by its own strength. And those who cannot accept that cannot call themselves true partners. The sentence landed with finality, the kind that cannot be walked back. A hush followed, deeper than before. Delegates looked around, as though confirming with their neighbors that they had indeed heard what they thought they heard. The moderators fumbled again, unsure whether to cue applause or move on. But the moment had its own momentum. Finally, applause broke, hesitant at first, then growing. Some clapped with enthusiasm, others reluctantly, their eyes darting toward MBS's delegation to measure their reaction. But regardless of intent, the sound filled the hall. MBS sat still, his jaw tightening slightly, his face composed into a mask of neutrality. But the cameras caught enough, the flicker of irritation, the narrowing of his eyes. He had entered the summit expecting to dictate, to declare, to dominate. Instead, he found himself challenged, his words reframed, his leadership denied. Outside the hall, the ripple spread faster. News agencies cut their broadcasts, replaying the exchange. "We'll lead Africa. Africa leads itself." Already commentators were dissecting it, activists were quoting it, and citizens were sharing it. What was supposed to be a summit of investment had transformed into a battle of narratives. Inside, Traoré ended his speech not with flourish but with calm finality. "We ask for no permission to exist. We ask for no crown to govern. Africa has already chosen. Africa leads itself." He stepped back from the podium unhurried, his posture unbent. The applause swelled once more, mixed, complicated, but undeniable. Some clapped in genuine agreement. Others clapped out of necessity. But all knew they had witnessed a moment that would echo far beyond this room. As he sat down, Traoré's face remained calm, even serene. It was the face of a man who had spoken not just for himself, not just for his country, but for a continent that had long waited for such clarity. The cameras cut once more to MBS. He sat poised, still, but the flicker of challenge was undeniable. The duel was no longer hidden. It was open. The summit would continue. More speeches would be made, more agreements signed. But beneath all of it, the clash between two visions, one of external leadership, the other of self-determination, would define the legacy of this gathering. And outside, on the streets of Africa, the words were already being claimed as their own. Chanted, painted on walls, printed on banners. Africa leads itself. The applause faded, but the silence that followed was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of anticipation, like the seconds before thunder. Cameras lingered on MBS, searching for a crack in his mask, a flicker of response. He did not stand immediately. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, sipped from the glass of water beside him, and only then pressed the microphone. His voice, when it came, was even, too even. "Brother Traoré speaks with passion. But passion is not enough to feed nations, to build roads, to power cities." The hall shifted. His tone was calm, but his words were sharp, crafted to cut without raising volume. "We offer more than words. We offer capital, technology, infrastructure. Without such support, what will Africa lead? Speeches, dreams? History has shown us strength is not declared. Strength is built. And we, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, the partners here, are ready to build." His voice deepened slightly, threading authority through reason. If Africa walks alone, it risks isolation. But if Africa accepts leadership, guidance, partnership under structure, then its future will be secured. The phrase "under structure" hung in the air. It was subtle but unmistakable. Structure meant hierarchy. Structure meant order. And at the top of that structure, MBS implied, would be him. The audience murmured, tension pulling them between the two poles. Some nodded. After all, money built cities, not speeches. Others frowned, hearing in his words the echo of every empire that had once spoken of guidance before domination. The camera cut to Traoré. He remained seated, unmoving, his gaze fixed on MBS. The soldier's stillness against the prince's polished rhetoric was its own form of resistance. The moderator, voice tight, attempted to shift. "Thank you, Your Highness. Perhaps we should." But MBS raised a hand gently, signaling he was not finished. "Africa's young leaders must be wise. Pride cannot pave roads. Pride cannot power hospitals. And pride cannot defend against those who see weakness as opportunity. Look at history. Nations that chose pride over partnership collapsed. Nations that chose guidance thrived." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, not at the hall but directly at Traoré. "So I say again, we will lead Africa. Not to own it, to save it." The final sentence landed heavy, half reassurance, half command. The hall froze. Cameras swung toward Traoré again. Would he respond? Would he let it pass? Slowly, deliberately, Traoré rose. No rush, no panic, just a man choosing his moment. He did not walk to the podium this time. He spoke from where he stood, his voice calm but clear. Save it? He let the words hang as though tasting them. Then he repeated louder. Save it from what? From ourselves. From the people who built civilizations before yours? From the soil that fed its children long before oil fed your wealth? A ripple spread through the hall. MBS's jaw tightened slightly. Traoré continued, his cadence sharp now, not rehearsed but born of instinct. You speak of capital. Yes, capital can build roads, but capital also builds chains. You speak of technology. Yes, technology can power hospitals, but it can also power surveillance, dependency, control. And you speak of history. Let us speak of it honestly. Every empire that came to Africa came speaking of guidance. Every empire came speaking of saving us. And every empire left with our resources in their ships, our people in their cages, and our dignity buried under their flags. The murmurs grew louder. Some clapped softly, unable to contain their agreement. Others sat stiff, glancing nervously toward MBS's delegation. Traoré raised his hand not to silence them but to sharpen the moment. You say Africa risks isolation if it walks alone. I say Africa risks slavery if it does not. And between isolation and slavery, we choose neither. We choose sovereignty. His voice rose, not shouting but resonant, the kind of rise that carries beyond microphones. You speak of leadership, but true partnership does not need a leader. It needs equals. And Africa will no longer sit at the children's table, waiting to be served. We build with those who respect us, or we build alone, but we do not kneel. The hall erupted, not full applause, not yet, but gasps, murmurs, the sound of a hall split in two. The weight of the exchange had transformed the summit from diplomatic theater into an open duel. MBS's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed irritation, the faint glimmer of a challenge that had been met where he least expected it. Narration, if written, would say, it was no longer about investment. It was about narrative. Who defines Africa's future, the prince with wealth or the soldier with words? Traoré lowered himself back into his seat, calm once again. The storm he had unleashed settled around him, but he showed no strain. The moderator exhaled audibly into his microphone. Thank you, President Traoré. Thank you, Your Highness. Perhaps we should allow other leaders to. But no one was listening. The duel had consumed the hall. Every delegate knew that the summit's official agenda, the trade deals, the memoranda, the projects, was now secondary. History had rewritten the script in real time. And beyond the walls, on millions of screens, two visions now collided. One of guided leadership framed as salvation, one of self-determination framed as survival. The clash of visions had begun. The hall had witnessed the exchange, but outside those walls the world was already living it. Within minutes, the confrontation spread across every screen, every platform, every network. Cameras captured the duel in crisp detail. MBS, polished, authoritative, offering leadership as salvation. Traoré, calm, unyielding, striking back with sovereignty as defiance. Two men, two visions, one stage. The narration could have read, when leaders speak to each other, they also speak to the world. And when the world hears, it chooses sides. In Riyadh, inside a palace chamber, advisors huddled around large monitors, replaying the footage. Some looked nervous, others defiant. Your Highness defended order, one said confidently. Many will agree. Africa cannot build without allies. Another, more cautious, muttered, but his words, they're viral already. He's capturing hearts, not contracts. That's dangerous. A silence settled, heavier than marble walls. MBS's advisors knew the prince's power was not only wealth but narrative, and in that moment narrative had slipped even slightly into another's hands. In Ouagadougou, a small cafe was packed with young men and women, eyes glued to a flickering television. When Traoré's words rang out, "We do not kneel," the room erupted. Some stood, fists raised. Others pounded tables, chanting, "Africa leads itself." An old man at the back whispered almost to himself, "I have heard many speeches, but this one feels different." A student replied, "Because it's not a speech. It's a refusal." In Washington, at a think tank, analysts watched carefully. One tapped a pen against his notebook. "If this grows," he said, "it could disrupt the whole balance of partnerships in Africa. He's not just rejecting the Gulf, he's rejecting dependency itself. Another added dryly, and if his words inspire copycats? You could see a wave of leaders refusing conditional aid, refusing military bases. A sovereignty movement we can't control. The room fell silent. They knew the real battle was not military. It was narrative. In Paris, at a press conference, a French journalist held up her phone. President Traoré's statement is everywhere, she said. Do you believe Europe's partnerships in Africa are at risk? The official shifted uncomfortably. Our partnerships are built on mutual respect. The journalist chuckled quietly. They had heard that phrase before, so had the world. But now, in the shadow of Traoré's defiance, such words felt hollow. The streets in Dakar, murals began appearing overnight. Traoré painted larger than life, his hand raised, the words "Africa leads itself" painted boldly beneath. In Lagos, rappers and poets began sampling his words into music, turning his defiance into rhythm, his challenge into chorus. In Nairobi, university students marched with placards, "No more leaders, only equals." Narration might have said, "What begins in a summit hall does not end in a summit hall. It seeps into streets, into voices, into culture, and culture once moved is harder to silence than armies." Back at the summit, the atmosphere had changed. Delegates whispered not about projects or trade, but about who had won the moment. Some leaned toward MBS, money still mattered after all. Others leaned toward Traoré, dignity too was currency. The moderator struggled to carry on, introducing other leaders. But every new speech was measured not against policy, but against the clash already delivered. One West African president whispered to his aide, "If I stand with Traoré, I risk investment. If I stand against him, I risk my people." It was no longer diplomacy. It was survival of image, the digital battlefield on Twitter. Hashtags dueled. Africa leads itself surged across African nations, fueled by youth movements and diaspora voices. Guided leadership trended briefly, pushed by Gulf-linked accounts but lacked the same fire. Memes flooded in. One showed Traoré standing tall with the caption, "We are not projects." Another showed a chessboard, MBS with gold pieces, Traoré with stone ones. The caption read, "Stone still breaks kings." The risk, but with momentum came danger. In a private message thread, African activists warned each other, if his words spread too far, they will try to silence him, like they did to others before. Another replied, then it's our job to make his words bigger than him. That way they can't kill them. Narration break. The documentary voice would pause here, lower, more solemn. The clash between MBS and Traoré was not a debate. It was a spark. Sparks by themselves fade quickly, but if they fall in dry grass, they become fire. And across Africa, the grass was dry. Back to the duel, MBS sat silent, his expression unreadable, but his advisors scribbled rapidly. He had the resources to counter. Billions in aid, billions in projects, and most importantly, allies across the continent who depended on his capital. Traoré, by contrast, had no billions, no sprawling economy to back his defiance. All he had were his words, and the belief that words once freed could not be captured again. The hall felt it. The world felt it. This was no longer a summit. It was a battlefield.